How do you assess the potential impact of a second Trump administration on U.S.-Iran relations?
Based on the first term of President Trump, we've seen that he was the only president ever since the Iranian Revolution that brought in a maximum pressure on the regime. A factor that indeed proved to be helpful in the sense that the Iranian people saw that the regime had to backtrack, was having less access to funding to maintain its suppression at home and finance its proxies abroad. And for that matter, it was certainly a clear distinction between his administration and the current one. That was mostly forcing appeasement, which basically emboldened the regime and led to many unfortunate results as a consequence. I have to assume that in his second term, the same approach will be pursued. What we hope as Iranians is that parallel to maximum pressure, there is the inclusion of maximum support for the Iranian people. And I'm saying this because in our struggle for liberating ourselves from this repressive regime, as you know and you have witnessed, the regime has been extremely brutal and repressive. And the Iranian people cannot be completely defenseless fighting such a system without having some means of an equal field to have better chances to succeed. And that's very important for the world to understand, including, of course, key Western governments, including the US government, that change is necessary, and that's the ask of the Iranian people. But like many other movements we have seen in history, in modern history, there has been an element of support at some point that helped those countries liberate themselves. Case in point, Poland with Lech Walesa and Solidarity Movement. We can refer to the South African example of Nelson Mandela and the ANC vis-a-vis the apartheid regime there, and so on and so forth. So it's that same school of thought that I think today the focus should be what is going to be the second term policy vis-a-vis the regime. And of course, the importance of distinguishing between the people of Iran on the one hand and the regime on the other.
Okay, so would you support the return of the maximum pressure policy, and how do you think this will affect both the Iranian regime and the people of Iran?
Look, the Iranian people have never benefited under this regime financially. If anything, they have starved under this regime. This is a regime that doesn't care about the Iranian people. Khamenei's war against the world is not the Iranian people's war. But as we have witnessed, and the fact that in the last 4 years, they had access to over $200 billion worth of oil revenue that they shouldn't have had in the first place. What was it used for? As we speak, our Iranian rial has been devalued 10,000 times what it was worth at the time of the revolution. Inflation is over 40%. People are in line for fuel. They don't have adequate basic needs. Electricity is cut off, water is cut off. All this time, the money has been spent on proxy wars in the region and certainly not benefiting the Iranian people. So I have heard people say sanctions hurt the nation. Iranians are already sacrificing, and even if the sanctions were lifted, they're not going to see a dime of that money being spent on them. So therefore, the only element here is how do you weaken the regime, make it less virulent to pursue any of its objectives, whether it's the nuclear program, whether it is the funding of terrorist organizations and proxies, whether it is repression of their own citizenry at home, and many other aspects. So yes, in fact, it is important to bring in maximum pressure on the regime. But as I said, maximum pressure is not going to be sufficient to have change. But at this point, if I may, the main question really should be, does the world recognize that the solution ultimately is for the regime to no longer be in place? In the last 4 decades, the basic policy of Western countries in particular vis-a-vis Iran was based on the false premise of behavior change. So whatever followed with their policy of imposing sanctions was more with the expectation of forcing the regime back to the negotiation table, and in a way using that approach, sometimes the carrot, sometimes the stick, as the saying goes, but really in the context of still within the status quo. And today, what I'm saying is that if you look at the Iranian situation right now, if you look at the narrative within Iran, even former reformists who thought that perhaps via reform, change could occur, they have given up on that concept. They have come to the conclusion that this regime is irreformable. Second thing, the world needs to understand that this regime doesn't think strategically. It's an ideological regime. It's an ideology that is inherently against the principles and values that are cherished in the free world. And they have proven it in action. So there's no way that you can come to terms with them or cut a deal with them. And therefore, the solution should be ultimately what the Iranian people are calling for, an end to this regime, so that tomorrow we can have a secular, democratic, free Iran that, unlike this regime that is warmongering, want to have peace in the region, have cordial relationship with our neighbors, whether Arabs or Israelis or whoever else, because that's the future we all depend on. That's why it's important for the world to understand that their support for the Iranian people is the best remedy to alleviate all of the concerns that are connected to this regime, not just the nuclear issue, but many other aspects of it.
You visited Israel last year. What was the primary goal of that visit, and do you feel that your interaction there have led to tangible outcomes or a shift in the region's perception of your vision for Iran?
First, let me say that I believe that Iran's future would be best served if we have, especially after having 40 years of a religious dictatorship based on one ideology and political Islam, which is not, I think, the viewpoint of majority of Muslims around the world. Whenever you have an ideology that is, basically repressing any other thought, it's the beginning of repression and inequality and violation of human rights. When you look at what the regime did from the very beginning, for a country that had, for centuries, people of different ethnicities and religions living together side by side in peace, Muslims, Shiite, Sunnis, Christians, Baha'is, Zoroastrians, and so on and so forth. The minute this regime took over, it immediately started to alienate its own population. People had to flee the country because they were Jewish or because they were Baha'i. Women became second-class citizens. Long story short, a secular democratic future for Iran, when there's clear separation of religion from state, is very important in order to achieve that, because it is only under that rule of law and equality that anyone with any faith can freely practice his or her beliefs without fear of persecution. This is the setting the stage for what I want to tell you. 25 centuries ago, Cyrus the Great basically coined the essence and principles of human rights when he liberated slaves in Babylon and helped them rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. We, as Iranians today, are descendants of that legacy. And one of the reasons I traveled to Israel was to break the taboo and to say, listen, a different Iran, a secular Iran, doesn't have animosity to any country, any nation, any faith, because we would like to be able to guarantee those equalities and liberties to our own citizenry, and beyond our own borders, have that relationship with the world. We are not anti-Arab, we're not anti-Israeli, we're not anti-Islam, we're not anti-Jew. We are for human rights and liberty. And it was important to emphasize the difference of what a different Iran would have in terms of its relationship vis-a-vis Israel and the Jewish people, as opposed to this regime that basically wants to wipe them off the face of the earth. Point number two was the fact that, again, part of that vision, collective vision of what we can all benefit from in a fruitful, constructive relationship in the future, in terms of challenges that we face, I wanted to make sure that I can see in what way, understanding that many of the top expertise and specialists of water management happen to be Israelis, in what way we can have their assistance and help one day when the situation changes to help our country. But most importantly, to be able to say to the world that I visited Israel, I went to Jerusalem, I went to the Haifa temple of the Baha'is, I went to the Vatican, and the message about doesn't matter which faith, which country, it's the principle. Setting that vision of my presence there means bringing a message of peace and brotherhood rather than conflict and hatred. And for them to understand that this is what the Iranian people actually want. What Khamenei is dreaming of and wants has nothing to do with the aspiration of the Iranian people. I wanted to make sure to make that distinction and bring that message to the Israelis and also, of course, to the rest of the region.
All right, here I would like to move a little bit to the Israeli-Iranian latest escalations, and what's your take on these escalations, and what are your main concerns, and do you think Israel will attack Iranian soils again?
Look, I think the real question is, given this change, is the regime going to show more restraint and be less emboldened to try to escalate yet again? And I think the election of President Trump may have a lot to do with their rethinking of to what extent they want to have this escalation. I don't think the Israelis plan to escalate. They were first attacked, they responded. But if Iran was to attack again, well, obviously we have to expect another response from the Israelis. But my argument has always been that if the focus is, okay, the nuclear threat by Iran is the key concern, and that includes the concern that some countries in the West would have. But is it the only problem? In other words, if all this argument about escalation and coming to some kind of a nuclear deal is part of the general thinking, the main question is, even if you had a deal in place, does that eliminate the rest of the problems that the regime will create? So if you're talking as a whole about focusing on one aspect only and define the entire issue of conflict or escalation on that issue alone, that would be a mistake. And I think that if you think more about the fact that the quickest way to put an end to the problem is not to worry about retaliation and escalation, but eliminating the problem at its root, which is the regime in Tehran itself, then you fall back into the narrative, is there an opportunity for real change now? Are the Iranian people ready? Is the region ready? Aren't they tired of false promises of a regime that has proven to be completely unreliable in terms of being trusted into what it is that they put their signature to? So whatever is the current immediate response to what needs to happen or who will do what as a result of an escalation or not, it is also important to think of an alternative to the general situation at the same time, while you are focused on what needs to be done. I wanted to point that out. So it's not only the focus on one specific issue, but a bigger picture of what could happen.